We're going to look now more specifically at this question related to free will and predestination, or the idea that God has determined before time perhaps began, or certainly before human history began, who was going to be saved and who was going to be damned. Remember that this is a question in the Augustinian tradition, not in the Orthodox tradition. So, to review, Augustine, particularly the late Augustine, believed that people were born not just into a broken situation, but with original guilt, born guilty. That God chose some to elect some for salvation, and then would infuse those elected with charity. The non-elect would be damned. Aquinas basically works with the same idea. People born with original guilt, God's grace is necessary in order to be moved for justice, and God moves some towards justice or in the direction of justice than others, and the non-elect are damned. The thinkers that we're looking at today are in this tradition. And one of them was Luther. Now, Luther fits Aquinas somewhat, and Augustine very well, in a lot of ways. He believed, again, in original guilt, and he believed that God's salvation was a pure gift. It came from God, and it had nothing to do with human merit. Where he differed from Augustine was where Augustine really did have an infusion model. God infused the person with love. Remember that Luther had an imputation model. God imputed righteousness or granted righteousness to a person based on Jesus. What Luther didn't like to talk about was predestination. He says that this is how I have taught in my book on the bondage of the will and elsewhere, namely that a distinction must be made when one deals with the knowledge or rather the subject of divinity, for one must debate either about the hidden or about the revealed God. With regard to God insofar as he has not been revealed, there is no faith, no knowledge, and no understanding. And then he basically goes on to say, if predestination is something that happens, we don't have access to it. That's not what we're told. What we're told is Jesus. So assume that the fact that Jesus came means that God wants to save you, and hold on to that hope. Luther didn't think predestination was something we could talk about. We really couldn't know. All we could know from our side is that Jesus had come and that was good enough. Some people would argue, however, that Luther's understanding of salvation makes predestination pretty hard to avoid. If you're born in original guilt, you can't do anything to save yourself. God has to impute righteousness to you. You end up with God choosing to impute righteousness to some and not others, or you end up with universalism, God imputing righteousness to everyone, which Luther did not believe. You could say that God just takes, people who have faith, and that's what saves people, but then that can kind of make faith a work. So where Luther stood on predestination is contested. In Luther's own head, where he stood is we can't know, and it's really not a question we should ask. You can contrast that with John Calvin, who did think it was a question you should ask, and he liked the answer. But I want to start here by taking a theme of John Calvin's and emphasizing it: the sovereignty of God. For Calvin, the sovereignty of God was an idea around which he built the rest of his theology. God is sovereign. And some people, at least today, would claim that John Calvin's view of sovereignty was very much akin to the kind of sovereignty that a king would have during the time of the divine right of kings. Absolute sovereignty or absolute control. The belief that in order to be sovereign, God had to control everything. John Calvin doesn't start his theology with predestination. John Calvin wrote something called the Institutes of the Christian Tradition. They come in 2 books. They're each about that size. And he doesn't actually talk about predestination until the second book, or the second volume. But the idea of sovereignty does come throughout his work, and it's what leads him into predestination. I will also note that John Calvin differed a little bit from Luther in that he had a bit more emphasis on sanctification or becoming holy throughout his theology. If you'll remember, Luther certainly does think that people need to be holier, they're free to be holy, but he's hesitant to emphasize that too much. Calvin, more than Luther, talks about the necessity of using the law as a way to guide us into holiness once we have been justified. So let's talk a little bit more about Calvin and predestination specifically. Calvin absolutely believed in predestination, the belief that God had elected some to salvation and elected others for damnation. And he held on to this doctrine for a couple of reasons. First of all, he thought it was biblical, particularly drawing from the book of Romans, where Paul talks about election. Now, a lot of scholars today would say that what Paul is actually talking about is the election of Israel, and trying to think through how it can be that Israel remains elect even with the inclusion of the Gentiles. Calvin, however, read this, among other things, as being about personal election, about people being elected. And what he saw is that God elected for reasons that only God knew. A famous line in Romans, or Jacob I have loved, Esau I have hated, coming from the Genesis story where God chooses Jacob, the younger son, and not Esau, the older son. He talked about God electing some people as vehicles of wrath. That's language used in Romans. So John Calvin just said election is biblical. God elects Israel, God elects Jacob, God elects people throughout, and he chooses some and he doesn't choose others. And God doesn't have to explain God's reasons. God does this because it is to the glory of God. And how do we know it's to the glory of God? Because God does it. John Calvin believed that God was able to do what God wanted, and something was good because God did it. If God did it, it was, by definition, good. Again, he thought that the doctrine of predestination was necessary for God's sovereignty. For Calvin, it just didn't make any sense to say that God allowed things to happen that he didn't want, or that someone would go to hell and God wouldn't want that. John Calvin said if God is in control and God is omnipotent, God is all powerful, then surely everything that happens must be what God wants to happen. Thus, if there are people who go to hell, that must be because God wants it. And if there are people who go to heaven, that must be because God wants them to. Like Luther, he believed in original guilt, so we're born guilty. So part of what John Calvin would say is, look, you were born guilty. You don't deserve heaven. No one deserves heaven. You don't earn that. You weren't good enough for it. It is grace, it is mercy that anybody is elected. So don't complain. Fair is not a theological category John Calvin has any time for. Calvin would also further say is like, look, you were born a sinner and you couldn't do anything about that, but you also enjoy your sin. Like he said, don't kid yourself. You enjoy the bad things you do. So again, you kind of deserve what you have coming to you. Another related doctrine for Calvin was providence. This, for Calvin, is about how God controls or acts in the world, not just about predestination, but about God's involvement in kind of the everyday running of the world or governance of the world. Now, to be clear, providence isn't just a doctrine for John Calvin. Most Christians have a doctrine of providence about how God works in events and works for good. What Calvin's going to say, though, very strongly, is that if something happens, it happens because God wanted it to happen. There are a lot of theologians who want to make a distinction between God allowing something or God having like permission, being permissive, and God choosing. So that bad things happen, and that's because God allows them, but God doesn't choose those things. Calvin thinks that's a meaningless distinction. He thinks that if God is omnipotent and God is sovereign, that means that God must be willing everything that happens. God doesn't just permit, God wills everything that happens. And again, for people like, oh, that seems bad, Calvin would say that it all goes to the glory of God, that God is working out history to God's glory. This is the point at which a lot of people really hate John Calvin. It's not the most attractive doctrine, after all. I think, again, it's important to remember that Calvin understands himself as simply being consistent. He starts with an Augustinian framework. You were born a sinner. You cannot save yourself. You cannot justify yourself. There is nothing that you can do. The only hope you have is that God comes and justifies you, turns you to God. And for Calvin, then the only thing that you can say is that God does that for some people and not others. It just seems evident to him that that's what's happening. And again, with his doctrine of sovereignty, or his understanding of sovereignty, it doesn't make any sense to say that God isn't active in this, right? If for God to be sovereign, God must be making the decisions. Not all people, not even all people that agreed with other parts of the Reformed tradition, liked this idea. And that led to something called the Arminian controversy, with generations of Calvinists that came after Calvin. So Calvin had died by this point, but who began to argue about Calvin's doctrine. And the leader was a man by the name of Jacob Arminius. One way to think about this controversy is through the TULIP acronym. So I'm going to talk about what the Calvinists who followed Calvin believed, and then what Arminius believed. What everybody in the group agreed on was what they called total depravity. Again, this is the doctrine that people are born unable to save themselves. Total depravity doesn't actually mean that we're bad as we possibly could be. It doesn't mean that you do the worst thing you could possibly do in every single circumstance, but it means that we are born unable to save ourselves. Arminius agreed with that. Calvin and the people who fought kind of in Calvin's vein agreed with that. All right. Then what Calvin said, and this is the part in the parentheses, or what the Calvinists following Calvin said, was unconditional election. God elects from the beginning who God is going to save, and that's an election without condition. It's not done based on God's foreknowledge of merit, because for Calvin, then that's works. God is save you based on your works. Calvin says no, God elects simply because God decides to elect some people. It's unconditional. God elects who God elects without condition, just because God decides to elect those people. Then again, now we're not doing the parentheses are not Calvin here. Limited atonement. I know it'd be nice if the parentheses were always Calvin and the not parentheses always Arminius. It doesn't work that way. It's a cool acronym, but it's not quite that cool. So Calvin said limited atonement. What Calvin and the Calvinists said after him is that Jesus only died for the elect. So Jesus' death does not actually apply and never was meant to apply to the unelect. Then, back to parentheses for them, irresistible grace. According to Calvin and the Calvinists who followed them, grace is irresistible. If God offers you grace, you will not be able to resist it. You will accept it and be justified. And then perseverance of the saints. If you are given grace, you will persevere in that grace. You will persevere in the Christian life. That's what Calvin and the Calvinists said. What Arminius said was, yes, total depravity, but conditional election. Arminius argued that God is electing people based on foreknowledge of what they will do, of their response. He argued for an unlimited atonement, that the atonement was open to anybody who wanted to respond. Resistible grace. Arminius said you can resist grace. God offers everyone grace, and some people resist it and some don't. And then no perseverance of the saints. Arminius said you could actually fall out of following God if you wanted to, or if you did over time, that was possible. So again, in the Calvinist tradition, you had same understanding of original guilt, basically a Lutheran understanding of justification by faith, but a real emphasis on this question of election and predestination that then began to split the Calvinist movement. Next, in the next series, we'll talk about John Wesley, who follows this more Arminian strand.